Hello everyone, and welcome to the Wayfair Coding Academy Python tutorial series, where we will cover everything you need to know in order to start programming in Python. But before we get started, if you are still wondering why you should learn Python, here are a few simple reasons. For starters, even if you are completely new to coding, Python is a very easy language to pick up. It's also incredibly popular and has many uses: automation, robotics, and even game development, just to name a few. And there are plenty of jobs out there looking for Python developers, with a minimum salary being over $60,000 according to both Indeed and Glassdoor. In this video, I will walk you through setting up Python, setting up a code editor, and help you write your first program. One quick thing to note, in all of my videos, I will be using a Linux operating system, but it shouldn't be a problem at all for those who want to program on Windows or Mac. This is because Python code is, for the most part, compatible across all platforms. There are some exceptions to this case, such as file path handling or using libraries that rely on native code. Now let's get started, shall we? The first thing we need to do is install Python. If you're running Linux, you can use your package manager to install the latest version of Python. Windows and Mac OS users can head over to python.org to download the appropriate installer. If you use the installer, make sure you check the box to add Python to your path. Otherwise, you won't be able to use Python in the command line. Once the install is finished, open up a command line. For Windows, you can use either command.exe or PowerShell. Once you have a command line open, type Python and press enter. You should see this prompt appear, and it should show the version of Python you just installed. This is the Python interpreter prompt, and you can write Python code here line by line. Obviously, this is not good for writing anything huge and complex, but it's useful for quick testing and experimentation. Now type exit with a pair of parentheses at the end and press enter to close the interpreter. Next, we need to set up a directory to store our code and projects in. I have a directory called Codebase where I store all of my stuff in. And inside this directory, I have a folder called Python Tutorials with a hyphen. You can do something similar if you like, but for this series, you will just need to make sure you have a Python Tutorials folder like me. Now we need a tool for writing code. I will be using my go-to for coding in general, VS Code, which is free to use for both personal and commercial work. But you are free to use any program for editing code that you like. Some other programs used for coding include Vim, Emacs, and Notepad++. If you want to use VS Code as well, head over to code.visualstudio.com to download it. For Linux users, head to code.visualstudio.com/docs/setup/linux for instructions on how to install it for your system. Otherwise, if you're going to use a different tool, just skip ahead to this timestamp here where we get started with coding. For those of you who are going to install VS Code, go ahead and start it up, and click on this button here to search for extensions. Search for Python, which I have right here. I already have it installed, but for you, this should say install, and go ahead and click on it. This will provide a lot of useful tools for Python development on VS Code. Now, go to File, Open Folder, and select your Python Tutorials folder. A file explorer will open on the left side, showing an empty folder. But don't worry, we will be adding stuff to it in a bit. Finally, if you see on the menu bar here, you should see an option called Terminal. Click on that and then select New Terminal. You should see a little terminal screen appear at the bottom of VS Code. This is so that you don't have to switch between windows to edit your code and then execute your code. You can do it all on one screen. The terminal will always open up to the default shell that your system uses. If it's Windows, it's going to be PowerShell, and it will always open up to the folder that you have selected in your Explorer. And with that, you are all set to begin coding in Python. So let's go ahead and get started on writing our first code. First thing we need to do is add a file. So right click inside this Explorer here, and we're going to select new folder first. And I'm going to call it intro lesson with an underscore. Then right click that folder you just made and select new file. And we're going to call it hello.py. And it should automatically open the file on your screen here for you to begin editing. And we're going to add 2 lines of code to this file. So the first line here is called a shebang, and its purpose is to tell your system which Python it needs to use if you don't directly run the program with Python. In general, you only have to specify Python like I did here. You could also technically specify between Python 2 versus Python 3, but there's not really much of a reason to specify Python 2 anymore. Linux systems support the shebangs directly, but Windows systems do not. However, on Windows, for Python versions 3.3 and up, a utility gets installed. It's called Python Launcher for Windows, and that does interpret the shebangs for Windows systems. I'm not very familiar with Mac. I don't know if it can interpret shebangs on its own or if it also needs a utility launcher like Windows, so I'm not entirely sure about Mac. The second line is our actual Python code here. This is just a simple print statement. Print is a standard function in Python which can be used to output anything to the command line, whether it's text like this, some data from variables, or a combination of both text and data. You can even call an empty print statement to print out a blank line if necessary. I know it's not the most exciting thing to code, but printing is an important thing to learn first because it's the most common way for your program to tell you what it's doing and present information to you, especially when you're trying to debug your code. Now let's save the file and then turn your attention to the terminal. First, we need to change our directory to the intro lesson directory. Then we need to use the Python command on the file we just made. So Python space hello.py, and then press enter. And there you go. We've just run our first Python program and we printed a message to the screen. The last thing I want to cover real quick is how Python programs work in general. If you're someone with previous experience with languages like C or C++, but it's your first time working with a language like Python, then the first thing you may have noticed was the fact that we didn't have to compile anything. We just ran the command and it immediately ran the code. For those of you who are new to programming completely and did not understand what I just said, to keep the explanation simple, basically languages like C++ must be compiled into machine code in order to generate an executable that can run the program, like a .exe file. Languages like Python are referred to as an interpreted language because the code is read by another program and immediately executed line by line. That said, technically speaking, Python can be considered both a compiled and interpreted language because it has to be converted into something executable before it can, run. But instead of being converted into machine code and then combined into an executable, Python gets converted into a bytecode that is then executed through a program called the Python virtual machine. This is what makes Python a portable language because as long as you have the required version of Python installed, no matter what the operating system is, the code should be able to run. The other thing you may have noticed is that the code didn't have an established entry point, like in C++. Again, for those completely new to programming, languages like C++ require an entry point in order to run, usually in the form of a function called main. The program won't even compile in C++ if there's no main function. With Python, however, the file itself that you feed into the Python command is the entry point. A main function is not technically required, although it's still considered good practice to have one. But we'll get more into that when we start talking about functions. And with that, we'll stop here for now. Congratulations, you now have Python and a decent code editor installed, and you got to run your first program. If you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful, be sure to leave a like, and be sure to leave a comment below to let me know what you think. If you want to see more, head on over to the Wayfair Coding Academy channel to check out my other content. And while you're there, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on new stuff as it comes out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.